During what we now know as the early medieval period, notably from the 6th to the 9th centuries, Ireland was granted the name of the land of saints and scholars, all well known to us. During this time, and perhaps not for the first time in the land's history, Ireland stood up like a mighty oak out of the Dark Ages that was sucking the life from the continental Europe. The Irish produced some mighty folk who breathed life back into the continent. This could not have been done by a backward civilization, and nor was Ireland viewed as such at the time, for it was known as a centre of learning, education, spirituality, and culture. It is in this context that we find a man that most of a particular vintage may remember by his face alone. This man was one of those who took his learned mind to the continent and resuscitated ideas of old and sought to synthesize the old pagan worldview with the growing Christian or Catholic worldview. This man was John Scotus, or when I found him, I realized and called him the owl fella on the old fivers. And we will remember that in this time, Scotus did not denote somebody from Scotland, as Scotland was not called such at the time. No, Scotus meant somebody from Ireland, and if we were to be left in any doubt on this man's race, he dispelled it, whether this was his intention or not, by adopting the nom de plume, or the written name, the author's name of Eriugena, born of Ireland, or from the race of the people of Eru. So who was Eriugena, John Scotus? To frame Eriugena in his life and some of his works, I will now read from a great book called Medieval Philosophy from the collection of Frederick Copleston's History of Philosophy. So, Copleston says, one of the most remarkable phenomena of the 9th century is the philosophical system of John Scotus Eriugena, which stands out like a lofty rock in the midst of a plain. We have seen that there was a lively educational activity in the course of the century and, considering the standard, materials and opportunities of the time, a growing interest in learning and scholarship, but there was little original speculation. This is a fact which need cause no surprise in regard to a period of conservation and dissemination. But it is all the more remarkable that an isolated case of original speculation on the grand scale should suddenly occur, without warning, and indeed without any immediate continuation. If John Scotus had confined himself to speculation on one or two particular points, we might not have been so surprised, but in point of fact he produced a system, the first great system of the Middle Ages. It may of course be said that he relied largely on the former speculations of St. Gregory of Nyssa, for instance, and particularly on the work of the Pseudo-Dionysius. And this is quite true, but one can scarcely avoid the impression when reading his Division of Nature that one is watching a vigorous, profound and original mind struggling with the categories and modes of thought and ideas which former writers have bequeathed to him as the material on which he had to work, moulding them into a system and impregnating the whole with an atmosphere, a colour and a tone peculiar to himself. It is indeed interesting, if not altogether profitable, to wonder on what lines the thought of John Scotus would have evolved, had he lived at a later and richer period of philosophical development. As it is, one is confronted with a mind of great power, hampered by the limitations of his time and by the poverty of the material at his disposal. Moreover, while it is, of course, a mistake to interpret the system of John Scotus in terms of a much later philosophy, itself conditioned by the previous development of thought and the historical circumstances of the time, for example, the Hegelian system, one is not thereby debarred from endeavouring to discern the peculiar characteristics of John's thought, which to a certain extent altered the meaning of the ideas and categories he borrowed from previous writers. Of the life of John Scotus we do not know very much. He was born in Ireland about 810 AD and studied in an Irish monastery. Eriugena means belonging to the people of Erin, while the term Scotus need not be taken as indicating any near connection with Scotland, since in the 9th century Ireland was known as Scota Mare, and the Irish as the Scoti. It was doubtless in an Irish monastery that he acquired his knowledge of the Greek language. In the 9th century the study of Greek was, speaking generally, peculiar to the Irish monasteries. Bede, it is true, attained to a working knowledge of the language, but neither Alcuin nor Rabanus Maurus knew any Greek worth speaking of. The former used Greek phrases in his commentaries, but, though he must have known at least the Greek alphabet, these Graecia were taken over from the writings of other authors, and in general it has been shown that the occurrence of Greek phrases in a manuscript points to Irish authorship, or to some association with or influence from an Irish writer. The attention given to Greek at St. Gall, for instance, was due originally to Irish monks. However, even if the presence of Greca in a manuscript indicates an Irish influence, direct or indirect, and even if the study of Greek in the 9th century was characteristic of the Irish monasteries, it would be extremely rash to conclude that all Irish writers who used Greek phrases, still less that all Irish monks studied and knew Greek in any real sense. The use of a Greek phrase is, by itself, no more a proof of a real knowledge of the Greek language than the use of a phrase like fait accompli is, by itself, a proof of a real knowledge of French. And the number of even Irish monks who knew much more than the rudiments of Greek was doubtless small. John Scotus Eriugena, at any rate, was among their number, as is shown clearly by the fact that he was able, when in France, to translate from the Greek writings of St. Gregory of Nyssa and the works of the Pseudo Dionysius, and even attempted the composition of Greek verse. It would be absurd to take John's knowledge of the language as typical of the century, or even as typical of Irish monasteries. The truth of the matter is that he was, for the 9th century, an outstanding Greek scholar. Sometime in the 40s, John Scotus crossed over to France. In any case, he was at the court of Charles the Bald by 850, and occupied a prominent position in the Palatine school. There is no sure evidence that he was ever ordained a priest, but, whether layman or not, he was induced by Hincmar, Bishop of Reims, to intervene in a theological dispute concerning predestination, and the result was his work, Predestination, which pleased neither side and brought its author under suspicion of heresy. John thereupon turned his attention to philosophy, and in 858 he undertook, at the request of Charles the Bald, the translation of the works of the Pseudo Dionysius from Greek into Latin. These works had been presented to Louis the Fair in 827 by the Emperor Michael Balbus, but they had never been adequately translated. John then undertook not only to translate them, but also to comment on them, and in fact he published commentaries on the Pseudo Dionysius' writings, except on the mystical theology, though Pope Nicholas I made it a subject of complaint that the publication had taken place without any reference to him. John Scotus also published translations of the Ambiguo of Maximus the Confessor and the De Hominis Opifico of St. Gregory of Nyssa, and it appears that later he commented on St. John's Gospel and on Boetius's De Consolatine Philosophiae and Theological Opuscula. The work for which John Scotus is celebrated, however, is his Division of Nature, which he composed probably between 862 and 866. This work consists of 5 books and is written in dialogue form, a form of composition which was popular at the time, and which was much used by Alcuin and others. It is not a very easy work to interpret, since the authors attempt to express Christian teaching and the philosophical doctrine of Augustine on lines suggested by the Pseudo Dionysius and the Neoplatonic philosophy, leaves room for dispute whether John Scotus was an Orthodox Christian, or very nearly, if not quite, a pantheist. Those scholars who maintain his orthodox intentions can point to such statements as that, quote, "the authority of the sacred scriptures must be followed in all things," end quote, while those who maintain that he regarded philosophy as superior to theology and anticipated the Hegelian rationalism can point, for example, to the statement that, quote, "every authority, example that of the fathers, which is not confirmed by true reason seems to be weak, whereas true reason does not need to be supported by any authority," end quote. However, one cannot profitably discuss the question of interpretation until the doctrine of the division of nature has first been exposed, though it is as well to indicate beforehand the fact that there is a dispute about its correct interpretation. John Scotus seems not to have outlived Charles the Bald, who died in 877. There are indeed various stories about his later life which are given by chroniclers, example, that he became abbot of Atelny and was murdered by the monks, but there seems to be little evidence for the truth of such stories, and probably they are either legends or are due to a confusion with some other John. And that's the end of it. So there is an introduction to the old fella on the old fivers, John Scotus Eriugena, who had some interesting ideas, particularly in the context of when he was alive. So Europe obviously was being ravaged by the spread of Christianity, which led to pagan shrines being destroyed, pagans being killed, and pagan ideas being declared heretical, right, and punishable through excommunication, if not death at times. And so we find, interestingly enough, the man is spoken about as being ahead of his time. To me, this is a somewhat ignorant perspective on him, and not very insightful, because we can see that the ideas that he collated and the system that he came up with, his own system, right, it is built on the backs of what would be called pagan thinkers. And so it's not so much that he was ahead of his time, he was a legitimate product of his time and of the times that came before him. And not just the time that came before him, but the minds, the ideas, the thinking, the worldviews, the morality that came before him. And it's interesting that the ideas that he promotes, a sort of pantheism, an almost idealism, is not, it doesn't seem to be resurfaced till quite a number of years after the man died, right? And I'm not going to be given a total breakdown of his ideas solely. What I'm going to be doing in the next few editions to this are taking some of his ideas, and as this is obviously not a philosophy class, nor am I any way close to being or capable of being a philosopher teacher or a philosophy teacher or a lecturer. My interest is in bringing ideas to the forefront of our mind and seeing what lines of inquiry and what kind of tangents we can reasonably follow, what roads we can follow from ideas, regardless of what time they presented themselves in terms of human history. So I will be pulling from, obviously, Eriugena, John Scotus, also some psychology, contemporary perspectives on psychology in the last century or so, Carl Jung, and perhaps some other thinkers as well, maybe James Hillman and a few others, and just see if we can breathe some life into these ideas again, because I suppose at the time we find ourselves in, I think I've heard this suggested before, and I think it's pretty spot on, that in centuries to come, the age we are in might be viewed easily as the second Dark Ages. And I would like to float some ideas and build upon the backs and build upon the works of mightier men and mightier women who've come before us, to see if we can give ourselves something that makes life a little bit more valuable, or brings a little bit more value to our lives. So this is just one aspect of Irish history that is largely forgotten. Even in terms of the fiver, Eriugena's face was taken off it and it was substituted for a nun's face, however valid or warranted that might be, right? But the man went missing, and I think as an Irish person, or even just as people in general, people that are interested in ideas, it's worth going back and picking at the bones of these ideas to see if we can flesh them out again through a modern lens. Okay, so enjoy and best of luck.